Alrighty, hello everybody. James Cards FC here. Thank you guys so much for clicking on this video. Today I'm going to be talking about some soccer card market strategy, specifically around the topic of base cards and specifically talking about base cards in the modern or ultra modern era of the market, the history of them, the present of them, and what I believe may be happening to them in the future. So we'll go through that presentation today. Thank you so much, and I always say when I make a shorter version of slides like this is only, I believe, 4 slides. I always think to myself, this is going to be a really short video, but I'll probably get caught up on something and we'll end up going for 15 or 20 minutes. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started talking about base cards. So, starting off with the history of base cards. So, in the vintage and pre-modern era, base cards were usually the only cards produced in the sets, and for soccer, this was not an issue because the survivability of those cards were usually quite low, as well as the fact that the production was nothing like what happened in the United States for product. So, you may have heard of something in the 1990s called the junk wax era in the United States. This is when companies produced massive amounts of basketball, football, and baseball cards for the American market. They produced these print runs in the millions, and since the only cards in the set were base cards, they all didn't hold any value unless they were in pristine condition, which, due to how many were printed, there were still a lot that were made in pristine condition. So this is referred to as the junk wax era because the American companies just printed a bunch of base cards, and a lot of people lost a lot of money because they didn't really understand how many base cards were actually out there, and they invested a bunch of money in a bunch of base cards that ended up being worthless because everybody owned them. So on the American side, that was what the issue was. However, when we talk about soccer on a global scale, the production numbers for each of the countries are a lot lower, and the survivability of these cards are a lot lower as well, because when they were opened from the packs, they were not seen as investments and they weren't cared for as investments. So not only is survivability lower, condition was a lot more difficult in those times, both because the quality control in the factories were not that good and because people, like I said, did not treat them as investments. So the pre-modern and vintage eras for soccer are specifically usually okay. There are some caveats with specific sets, but for the most part, base cards are okay in the pre-modern and vintage era, but always go ahead and do additional research on that. With that being said, we're going to talk more specifically about the modern and ultra-modern era going forward in this video, and usually when I'm talking about base cards for the ultra-modern era, I'll probably refer to the things that I talk about here. So, however, in the ultra-modern era, companies are producing hundreds of thousands of cards for global mainstream releases, and producing only base cards would lead to oversaturation, which I just talked about, and the answer to that has become introducing more parallels to these sets so that instead of a bunch of base cards, you have a bunch of base cards as well as a bunch of parallels for people to chase. So when the soccer card market and the sports card market saw an explosion in interest just before and during the COVID-19 pandemic, many speculators flocked to base cards of modern players. The reason for this was a few different things. Mostly it was because base cards are super easy to understand and deploy capital into. They're also really easy to understand in terms of sales history, so you could just easily look up the price of a base card in PSA 10, and there weren't all that many of them graded at the time, so prices went insane at that point. So, which is actually my next point here. At the time, base cards were extremely undergraded because former market participants did not place much value in them. So, for example, this Messi base card right here was a $1 or $2 card ever since it released in 2014 up until 2019-2020, when it jumped in value as a base card from $1 to like $30 overnight at one point when people decided to start looking at this set. So these were not thought of as valuable at all for years. This was a $1 junk card that all of a sudden rose to prominence because all of a sudden a lot of people wanted to get in the soccer market, and this was the easiest possible set to understand because it was Prism, which was a set that was super popular in basketball at the time. So all the Americans that understood Prism understood that this was Messi's first Prism card, so it was easy to deploy capital in it that way. In fact, there were some ridiculous narratives at the time, like this was Messi's actual rookie card, because the Americans that were investing or spending capital in this didn't even care to do any research, so they just assumed this was his rookie card because it was his first Prism card. So that was this whole silly phase that if you weren't a part of it, be glad because it was ridiculous. But we are past it now, and now we understand all of Messi's releases, at least the most of the general soccer card market does. So That was an interesting time. As the last point says, this resulted in a supply shock that saw base cards reaching unsustainable prices. So, at the price peak, the PSA 10 population was under 100 for this card. This graph, unfortunately, doesn't even go far back enough to see this, but during this time frame right here, the PSA 10 population was under 100, and the pop now sits at over 2,000. So, as the population growth increases, the demand and willingness for people on the market to buy this card drops. These two charts run in inverse pretty much every single time you see them, so just understand that those are factors that are playing into each other. There was actually a narrative at the time when this card went from around $0 to $4,000 that they could actually be low population in PSA 10 because people never cared about the set from 2014 to 2020. Therefore, they probably didn't take good care of the cards, but that did not happen to be the case, and there were still a bunch of unopened boxes that had these in PSA 10 condition. So the population did indeed increase to the level that it is right now, sitting around 2,100 total population for PSA 10s. So the price reflects what happened there. So let's move forward to talking about the present of base cards. As more people have become aware of the population issues surrounding base cards, their prices continue to fall. Market sentiment on them has now dropped to all-time lows. In the 2020 / early 2021, people kept talking about base cards like they were all the rage. These are the easiest to understand, best investments. If you went to card shows, most people were transacting using base cards. So that has completely flipped, and now people are viewing these base cards more and more as junk, and most people at shows just are trying to get rid of them as fast as they can to move into different parallels. So the fact remains, though, that people still do buy base cards. The 2014 Prizm World Cup Messi that I showed you in PSA 10 condition consistently sells in the $150 to $200 range at this point, and it's done so for a 6-month or so period. So people are still transacting with this card, and in my hypothesis, this is because of the role the base cards play in the current market, and I'll explain that in a few bullet points. So point number one, they are cheaper entry points for market participants that can either not afford to play in the color parallel market or just don't want to, because you do have people that don't care about the colors. They just care about having one of the cards, and the base card is the cheapest version of that card, so they'll just go ahead and buy the base card. Nothing wrong with that, but it represents a cheaper entry point for people that don't want to buy the color parallels or cannot afford them. So they'll always have that place. They're also the easiest cards to understand. They have daily updated sales history. You don't need to derive their values from other parallels. For example, if you have a parallel numbered out of 25 that does not sell very often, it's very hard for you to try and figure out what the value of that is. So you'll be comparing it to previous sales of ones out of 50, previous sales of ones out of 25, previous sales of ones out of 10, and trying to come up with a range of what you think it's worth. Whereas transacting in base cards, there were multiple sales probably every single day, so you know exactly how much the value is at the time. And that makes things a lot easier on both sides of the transaction, from the buyer and the seller. Then the third point is you don't need to understand the full parallel checklist, which is becoming increasingly more difficult, and I'll explain that down below. But with base cards, it's very easy. You just understand what the base card market is, and you don't have to worry about any of those other parallels that are going on. Now there's 30-something of them in a Topps Chrome set, so you can completely ignore all those and just focus on the base, which makes things much more simplified. Last point here, base cards in ultra-modern product are being produced at higher and higher levels each year as companies are trying to play catch-up with demand for product. So companies are producing more and more base cards because they have to produce more and more boxes because people want more and more boxes of product. They're continuously able to sell them out pretty much at any price points they want to put up because people are always breaking product. Breakers need to break product to fill case breaks and box breaks, and then people also want to break them for personal fun and reasons. So product demand is at an all-time high, and in order to curb that demand, they have to increase supply, and to do that, they're increasing the supply of both parallels and base cards to make up for that demand. So I will take you through the years of the Topps Chrome UEFA flagship set and the amount of parallels that are in each set. So we start with 2017 in the bottom left. It had 8 parallels in addition to the base card. Then in 2018, you had 10 parallels. 2019, you had 15 parallels. 2020, you jumped to 25 parallels, and then this year, if my math is correct, there are now 32 parallels. However, they doubled the checklist, so the checklist now sits at 200 subjects, whereas previously it it was set to 100 subjects. So there's actually probably less base cards per player than there is in these sets. However, it is still a lot of base cards and a lot of parallels. So as the years have gone on, both parallels and base cards continue to increase in their population, and the only way that these companies can curb this is if they somehow get rid of base cards altogether, which they might actually end up doing. I could see a future where they just say, screw it, we're only doing parallels, and they do a set with like 150 different parallels. That'd be insane, but not out of the realm of possibility, I guess. And the other way to curb it is to continue doubling, tripling the checklist. So instead of 100 different players, you have 200 or 300. That would then decrease the number of base cards needed for a player. And with that, we'll move to the future of base cards. So in my opinion, barring a massive jump in demand in the market, base cards are very unlikely to return to their glory days during the pandemic. Base cards will still have their place as the most easily understood cards in the market. However, with such high production and so many color alternatives, I personally don't believe they present much long-term value, specifically because there are way too many of them. And there are way too many other options out there. If you wanted to buy a base card, you can almost, for similar prices, depending on the player, buy something that has some color to it. And people usually prefer the color stuff to the base stuff just because it looks nicer in a lot of cases. So that's always going to be out there. Third point here, the argument for base cards becomes an even better argument for easily understood parallels, but that's a theory for another video. So if you want to argue that eventually our market will be 10x the number of participants, therefore base cards are probably going to be much more valuable when our market 10x's the number of participants, that is a fair take. However, in that event, you're making an even better argument for easily understood parallels because those are much lower production, and if we have 10x the market participants, those could really increase in price given how few there are, and if they're easy to understand parallels, all the better. So that'll be a whole separate video I'll be doing in the future, but just keep that in mind. I do think it is possible that base cards could perform better than many of the non-number parallels, strictly due to them being easy to understand. So parallels like speckles or diamonds or I don't know, whatever the parallels are that are not numbered and hard to understand at this point, I do think there's a possibility the base cards could do better than them if the base card is looking better, has a more consistent sales history, all kinds of factors like that. I think base cards could still have relevance over those non-numbered parallels, but I don't think there's any scenario where base cards outpace blues, golds, oranges, reds, colors that have hobby history or market history, things like that. I don't think base cards could ever outperform, but specific things like, I don't know. I don't even know the parallels that are out there anymore. It's too much to think about, but things like speckles, things like diamonds that are unnumbered, stuff like that, nonsensical parallels that are not classically used in market checklist, I think there's a chance that base cards could outperform those because they're so much easier to understand. So that was a good ramble, but last 2 points here. We'll see if I can get through them. In the long run, 10 plus years, perhaps there is a scenario where the market grows so large that the modern era base cards experience a revival, but I would not count on it. And then we have this chart here that features one of my favorite base cards of all time, the 2014 Panini Prism Neymar World Cup in PSA 10. This card went from sub $20, I think, up to $4,000 at one sale, and then immediately all the way back down to the $1,000 range, and then continuing down and down and down. I think this card sits around $100 today. So in the event in 10 plus years our market 5x's or 10x's in participants, I think this card could have a revival of sorts. I'm not saying it could ever get back to the one sale at $4,000, but I do think if we have enough market participants, this card could see an increase, although that is pure speculation at this point. So again, I thank you guys so much for watching this video. Go ahead, leave a comment, leave a like, feel free to subscribe. Unless you think I have some bad takes and I didn't make any sense, feel free to leave a comment down below explaining what your thoughts are on the subject. I would love to have a conversation about this topic in particular. I think it's really interesting. Base cards were all the rage, and now nobody seems to want to touch them. So super interesting things that are going on in the market right now. As always, thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.